So thank you very, very much for inviting me. It is really a great honor and a special thing for me because I have a special connection with Japan, both because I love Japanese culture and also because I have a Japanese family. So I'm going to talk about the work that has been done by me, Simona Ginsburg, and was illustrated by Anna Zeligovsky, who is part of the whole project. Why doesn't it go down? So here we are, the three of us in the Israel Museum. This on the left you see Anna, in the middle you see Simona or Monzi, and on the right you see me. And this is a kind of pilgrimage that in non-corona times we always go to the Israel Museum to enjoy the art and to talk and to create kind of bonds that are so necessary for friendship and for joint work. So I'm going to talk about what the conscious being is, what I mean by consciousness. That's how I want to start because I want us to have a common language. For me, a conscious being is a being with subjective experiencing, a subjective point of view about the world and about its own body. It feels its body. It not only gets signals from the world, but it actually experiences the world. It smells the rose. It sees the blue sky with the clouds and so on, clouds here in England. And it feels like something to be that being, as Nagel put it. And the basic assumption that I'm going to work with is that conscious biological beings evolved from non-conscious ancestors. So that consciousness is a product of evolution. And my argument, our argument is that if we identify the transition from conscious mode of being to a conscious mode of being from a non-conscious mode of being, this can help us to recognize the basic principles of biological organization that underlie consciousness and also understand how it is distributed in the world, what the taxonomic distribution is. Now, the particular kind, so this is a very powerful, evolutionary biology is a very powerful tool. It is used always when in biology, whenever we want to understand some kind of phenomenon. We want to understand how it is built, how it is constructed, what the constraints are. History is very, very important, just as it is in other disciplines. Now, the particular type of approach that I'm taking is an evolutionary transition approach. So I'm looking particularly at the transition from something that is, most people will agree is non-conscious to something that most people will agree is conscious. I'm going to qualify this point later, but this is the thing. I want to look at this transition. So, and at the heart of this approach is a concept that I will explain in detail, in some detail soon. It is a concept of an evolutionary transition marker. Consciousness is a very slippery concept. It's very, very difficult to follow it, to identify, to follow it. But if we have some kind of marker that is much easier to follow and to understand and to identify, then we have made some kind of progress. So what is a transition marker? Transition marker is a property that when we find evidence of it, we have evidence that the major evolutionary transition in which we are interested has gone to completion. And it allows us to reverse engineer from the marker to the system that allows it. The marker, if it is a marker of consciousness, is not itself consciousness, but it allows us, it is the system that is conscious or not conscious. It allows us to reverse engineer from the marker to the system. Now, I know that this is not terribly clear, so I will give an example. We can illustrate this with the case of the origin of life. Life is also a very slippery concept. And no one, if you're looking at the literature, you find something like 300 different definitions or characterizations of life. And almost no one agrees precisely what it is, but there is enough consensus about capacities that if a system has them, most people will recognize it as alive. And these capacities for life are maintenance of a boundary, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of the internal milieu, growth, reproduction, and death. So irreversible disintegration. If we found something like that, for example, on Mars, then we will say, yes, this is a living system. Now, this is the starting point of the analysis of Tibor Ganti, which was followed by Maynard Smith and Satmary, of the transition, the particular transition to life. And they also proposed that a particular marker, although they didn't call it an evolutionary transition marker, but this is what they meant. And they said that if you have something like unlimited heredity, this system with unlimited heredity is alive. And unlimited heredity, a biological system. Unlimited heredity is the capacity to form lineages of open-ended length, varying in open-ended ways from the initial system. The DNA-based heredity system, or the nucleic acid-based heredity system of all life on Earth, is the only known biochemical example of an unlimited heredity system. So if you have something like that, you can say, well, this system has to be alive. And the reason that it has to be alive, so let me just explain again. So this is the transition marker. So the logic behind the transition marker is this. We have all this, we start with all this list of capacities that are characterizing, that jointly are sufficient to characterize a mode of being like life. So here we are, this is sufficient for characterizing a living system. Now we find a marker, in this case, limited heredity, which when it is present, it requires that all the properties of the list are in place. And therefore, this marker marks the presence of a living system. So we can, if we find, for example, something on Mars, something like a very long polymer line, similar to DNA or something like that, we can say in order for this long polymer to exist, we have to have a boundary and we have to have a system of metabolism and multiplication and so on and so forth. All the properties, the characteristics of life in the list have to be actually materialized, must be evidenced. And so we can reverse from the long polymer, such as the DNA, something like a protocell. And this protocell is alive. DNA is not alive, but the protocell is. So the general idea is we have a list of capacities. This list of capacities is sufficient for characterizing a particular mode of being, be it life, be it consciousness, be it rationality. This, we identify a transition marker, which when present, the whole list must be implemented. It requires the list, and therefore this transition marker marks the presence of the mode of being. This is the basic rationale of the idea of what an evolutionary transition marker is. And we are going now to apply this kind of logic, this kind of concept of methodology to the case of consciousness, which, like life, is a very difficult concept. Nobody exactly agrees with it. Nevertheless, when we looked at the literature, Simona and I, we saw that in spite of all the disagreements, and both at the metaphysical level and at the epistemological level and at the methodological level, any level you want, there is nevertheless a kind of consensus around what would count as a living system, a conscious system. And we found a list, and here is the list that we extracted from philosophical, cognitive scientists, and neurobiologists who have been thinking about consciousness. What a conscious being is one that unifies percepts. So there is some kind of binding and unification of percept. When you see the apple, you see it as round and green at the same time. There is global accessibility and broadcast, so that different systems allow you to put things together so you can evaluate the percepts that you get, or that you can have feelings about them, that you can make beliefs about them, that you can generalize on the basis of them. that you can pay or not pay attention to them, and so on. There must be processes of selective attention and exclusion for this to happen, because at any point, although there are a huge number of there is a huge number of inputs into our nervous system, we nevertheless have a particular, quiet, distinct, although it can be vague to some extent, but nevertheless quite distinct conscious experience. There must be some kind of intentionality. Think the kind of when we're conscious of something, we're conscious that there is an aboutness about it. When I see a cat, there is something I think about a cat, or I experience a cat as there is some kind of model in my head that is about the things in the world and in the body. There must be some kind of integration through time, what William James called the spacious present. The present has some kind of, the present is thick. It has some echoes of the past, and it has a horizon of the future. He said it's like a saddleback on a horse. It has thickness, and it is expressed as working memory. We must have, a conscious being has a flexible evaluation system, so it evaluates things in a context-dependent manner. It has agency. Inherently, all living organisms are not passive, they are active all the time. The exploration is an inherent part of any living system. They're of course embodied, and there is a registration of self and world. So a conscious organism makes a distinction between its own body and the world, and is aware of this distinction. I think that if we found something like that in the world, on Mars or in any other planet, we would say, well, there's a very, very good chance that this creature, this entity, is conscious. Now, this list is not an ad hoc list. This list, as we shall see, we can take this list and we can show how the different properties or capacities that are listed here form a system. Now, this is the list. What is the transition marker? So again, we thought a lot about it for a very long time. We tried out many, many things. And in the end, we came to something that is rather similar and was, of course, inspired by the unlimited heredity system that Ganti and Mannet-Smith and Satmary were talking about. And we found that the transition marker for minimal consciousness is something we called unlimited associative learning. Unlimited associative learning has 4 major requirements. It is associative learning, so you can predict from percept X about something about the value of something else that happens in the world, or about the consequences of your own actions. But it is more than simple associative learning. In order to have UAL, you have to have the following properties. It is necessary to distinguish among novel compound patterns of stimuli and action. For example, if you navigate a new terrain, you have to have the ability of discrimination. Discrimination, for example, between friend and foe, learning different routes for food and shelter, avoiding danger, and so on and so forth. And the learned patterns are genuinely novel. That is, it's not something that was already that is already evolved. It's not a reflex or an instinct eliciting pattern, nor is it something that you learned in the distant past. So you can actually learn new things, really new, genuinely new things. You can, in order to have UAL, you need also to manifest second order learning. So an animal learns the complex image or a new pattern of action, and this can then be the basis for further learning, cumulative learning. The animal has to learn that even if there is a time gap between a kind of neutral complex stimulus, let's say you see some kind of strange object, and this is followed by a reinforcement, even if there is and this strange object usually doesn't elicit any reaction whatsoever, but if there is reinforcement, it will become something to, if it's positive reinforcement, something to which you will approach. If it is negative, you will avoid it. But this will happen even if there is a time gap between the stimulus and the reinforcement. This is called trace conditioning in psychology. And so one of the requirements is the trace condition is in place. And the memory of the neutral predictive stimulus is stored even when the reinforcing stimulus is transiently unperceived. So it doesn't have to have a temporal overlap. It can be a real gap between them. And the value of a learned pattern can be flexibly changed. So you can, something that was good at one point can be bad in another, under other conditions, and you can prioritize different types of inputs according to context. If you have, these are general properties of fairly complex associative learning, not terribly complex. It's possible to have much more complex learning, of course, but we argue that if you have an animal that has this kind of learning is minimally conscious. And this is just an example so that you can have a feel of an unlimited associative learning. This is spatial learning by a little mouse, and it requires multimodal integration, agency, decision-making, flexible value systems, as it learns this environment to navigate in this new environment, which is quite complex. Now, I want to highlight some things about UAL. It is richly generative and it is recursive too. The number of associations that we can have and that can be learned and recalled within and between modalities during ontogeny far exceeds those that actually form during a lifetime. So the kind of things that you can learn is much greater than what you actually learn in your lifetime. And of course, for us humans, it's self-evident, but it's not just for us. Every animal, to put it in a new environment, you will find out that it can learn all kinds of things that in its old environment didn't learn, because it was not exposed to the same stimuli, to the same conditions, and so on. And the second thing is that second order and third order, in general, higher order learning implies recursive processes of representation. So you learn something is conditional stimulus, and it can become now predictive stimulus, and it can be used as an unconditional stimulus for further learning, and so on. And with actions, you can chain an action. You can learn to do X, and then on the basis of learning to do X, you can learn to do Y, and on the basis of knowing how to do X and Y, you can do Z, and so on. And in the same way that limited heredity enables open-ended evolution, unlimited associative learning allows open-ending ontogenetic adjustments. And through cumulative learning, it can lead to complex behavior. So we have here a form of learning that allows us to adjust to many environmental conditions. I'm not saying, when I'm saying unlimited, of course, I don't mean that it is mathematically unlimited. I mean that there is a lot of possibilities, many more than one can actually accomplish during one's lifetime. Now, all these cognitive and behavioral attributes, these 4 attributes that I mentioned before, all of them, they require that all the consciousness indicating capacities are in place. So binding and unification, obviously, we defined UAL as the ability to perceive complexes, compound things. Global accessibility, of course, because you form memories about things, you evaluate them. This leads to belief. You can generalize on this basis. You can make comparison, have discrimination, and so on. Selective attention, obviously there must be selective attention. Well, for every learning, you can have selection attention, but certainly when you prioritize things, you have to have mechanisms that exclude what you, that not only amplify what you want to do, but also exclude what you don't want to do, although the inputs are incoming. There must be some kind of mapping and representation in order for all this to happen in the brain. There must be integration through time, working memories necessary for this. And there must be some kind of flexible evaluative system which allows for trade-offs. I'm doing this and rather than this in these conditions, and I'm preferring this rather than that in that condition, and I'm prioritizing certain things according to conditions. Of course, there must be agency and decision making, and we're talking about an embodiment. It is not real. It is the material. There is a material embodiment to the system. I'm talking about biological organisms. So I want to stress that I'm talking about consciousness as we know it. And consciousness as we know it at the moment is only conscious. We have it only in conscious living organisms. I'm talking as a biologist about living organisms. So here is again the unlimited associative learning requires all this whole list of capacities that I was talking about. And this list of capacities, as most people would agree, is sufficient for having something that we call an experiencing system, a conscious mode of being. So unlimited associative learning marks the presence of an experiencing conscious system. Now, how functionally should UAL be implemented? What is the functional architecture of UAL is unlimited associative learning. So unlimited associative learning requires that there is integration of various underlying sensory signals to form compound percepts, and that there are models of the world and the body. And the encoding of signals must be recurrent, multi-stage, and hierarchical. Simply, there is no enough time nor enough space to do it otherwise. It's a constraint. The interactions between the signals from the world and the signals from the body from the self model and the world model. And so there must be models of representation of the self, of the world, and of prospective actions. And all these models must interact to form a model of the body of prospective action in the world. This is a self model. There must be a mechanism of exclusion of irrelevant signals and focusing mechanisms. There must be a dedicated memory system for compounds that enables subsequent retrieval based on learned compound patterns. And there must be an evaluation system that allows trade-offs and prioritization. Now, as I said, this is not the list of capacities is not, and the list and the kind of properties that a UAL, that an unlimited associative learning creature must have, are not just ad hoc. We can form a little toy model that instantiates them. And what I'm showing here, I will not go into details, but I just want you to concentrate on the colors. Sorry, I need to drink. Right, so what we have is sensory units, and there is a hierarchy of sensory units. There are sensory inputs that the organism receives, and are processed in dedicated sensory units. There are sensory units also that are through which signals which are inherently reinforcing or reinforcing because of past experience are sent, and they arrive to something that we call reinforcement integrating unit, where a lot of, because we assume that that different kind of that there are many kinds of positive and negative reinforcement unit, and they can be all compared, and some kind of decision has to be made as to what the organism will do. There must be a memory unit. This is the green one here, and there must be a motor integrating unit which models prospective action and which gets information from motor units, and the sensory and the motor and the reinforcement and the memory units have reentrant interactions with a central integrating unit. Now, there are lots of arrows here. So, and the arrows, what the arrows tell us is that there are both top-down and bottom-up interactions. So there are hierarchically both lateral interactions and, very importantly, also interactions, top-down interactions and bottom-up interactions. And we can interpret the top-down inputs into the lower parts of the hierarchy as kind of predictive models, which are all the time updated by information that comes from the bottom up and from the lateral units, laterally interacting units. So this is a basic kind of very simplified picture of the kind of system that has to be in place for unlimited associative learning to occur. And this system implements sensory motor binding. Here, the blue and there is binding within the blue units and the yellow units, and this purple unit here, which the accessibility is in place, because otherwise all the system would not be able to interact. There is systemic evaluation in the red unit, in the reinforcement unit, the selection and memory. Memory is shown here in green, and the selection here, the attention systems in this model, there are no special attention networks. There are attention. The attention is property of the exclusion and the exclusion mechanisms, the inhibition mechanism, the suppression mechanism, and the amplification mechanism that are occurring all the time at the synaptic level and at the level of reentrant interactions between groups, between neural circuits. Okay, sorry. Yes, so this is at the more general level that we see here. What we see here is it's kind of minimal UAL architecture, which is showing us the same kind of units. We just switched their place in order to make it clearer. So we have sorry, just have to move some things because they're obscuring my picture. We have actions and sensory stimuli, and we have the motor integrating units which models prospective action. We have the blue unit, which models all the kind of sensory stimuli coming both from the body and from the world. And so that is extroception and interoception and proprioception. We have here the integrating the unit which integrates the value signals. We have the central association unit, and we have the memory unit. And you see here the reentrant interactions, the double-headed arrow. And each of these units also has is shown here as a single unit, but really we have a hierarchy of this unit. These units are very complex, and there are units that they are memory, there are sensory, motor, and reinforcement units that are built in a hierarchical manner. So, this architecture we suggest is proposed to be sufficient for conscious experience in living organisms. Now, if we agree with this logic, with the logic that UAL is a good, plausible marker, evolutionary marker of consciousness in living organism, then this has a lot of implications for the research that we do. We can ask, how is it actually implicated? How is it manifest in living organisms? Which animal groups show UAL? And what kind of supporting anatomical, physiological structures, brain structures do they have? Neural structures do they have? We can ask this question and we can answer these questions, because UAL is something that we can actually study, that we can actually see. Can this animal do it or can't it do it? So when we looked at the literature and we tried to figure out what the literature on learning tells us, we found out that there are three groups in which UAL has been found, or rather a lot of types of learning which are good proxies for UAL have been found. And it was found in the mollusks, in a small group of mollusks, in the cephalopods, in the octopus, squid, and cuttlefish. We found it in many arthropods. Of course, not all, because only a very, very small number have been ever studied. So honeybee, for example, the cockroach, the fly. In most vertebrates, also we found it. I'm not, again, there are some groups that have not been examined. So these are the three groups, phyla, animal phyla, in which we found UAL, unlimited associative learning. And one interesting question is, how did it evolve? When did it evolve? And was it lost in some groups? And we think that it was, because there are creatures, for example, arthropods who are parasitic, who has very, very, very simplified nervous system and who can hardly learn at all. But their ancestors could. So we think that with the with the decrease in the complexity of the nervous system, consciousness was lost in these groups too. Now, these are the animals. So an animal with UAL basically exhibits many complex behaviors and is effective in attaining many goals. And something to which I will return shortly is that we also have some evidence that UAL, unlimited associative learning, UAL can be manifest only when an animal is conscious. You cannot have subliminal learning of unlimited associative learning tasks. Now, what is also interesting is that although at the structural level, the brains of vertebrates, arthropods, and cephalopods are very, very, very different, there are functional similarities between them. All of them have integration sensory centers to form compound configurations of the world, body, and their relations. They have dedicated memory systems that enable subsequent retrieval, and they have evaluation systems that allow prioritization. Now, of course, there is a hierarchy there in all of them, and there must be, although we don't always know exactly how this is accomplished, a distinction between body-generated and world-generated stimuli, because there is we see that the animals can distinguish very well between actions, between the same stimuli that is, if it is caused by the world, and the same stimuli if it is caused by their own action, and they respond differently to the stimuli according to their source. And of course, there is exclusion of irrelevant signals and focusing mechanism in all of them, otherwise prioritization would not be possible. So again, I'm not going to go into the details. I can leave, by the way, the PowerPoint here if you want, for anybody to have a look at it. So if you want, if we're looking at the actual brain structures that implement these capacities, we can find that vertebrates, arthropods, and coleoid cephalopods have these brain structures. We know more about vertebrates and arthropods than we know about coleoid cephalopods, but we know something about the latter group too. So we can identify the integrating units, the globally active value mechanisms and factors that correspond to the reinforcement integrating unit and the memory integrating unit in all three groups. I will not go into the bits of the anatomy because I don't think that we can remember them, and I don't think that at this point they are important for my argument. Okay. So here we have the vertebrate brain. This is the human brain. This is Shakespeare. This is the brain of an insect, the dragonfly. And this is and the bottom on the right, we have the kind of brain that we see in cephalopod mollusks. As you see, they are totally different. But it's very interesting. Nicholas Southfield and Frank Hirst have shown that in spite of the completely different organization of the insect brain and the mammalian brain, there is a great deal of similarity in their functional organization, which is very, very interesting and suggests that maybe they have evolved from a common ancestor, or that the constraints on this type of on the brain that can accomplish UAL are very, very strong. So maybe they have evolved in parallel. Maybe already the ability to have much simpler associative learning in both groups under certain very strong constraints is leading to functional organization like this. We cannot be sure about that. I want just to have a little note before we continue, and that is that I want to stress that unlimited associative learning is an evolutionary, not an ontogenetic marker of consciousness. So an animal that has the evolved UAL architecture, unlimited associative learning architecture, need not yet show the capacity to accomplish UAL tasks, because the accomplishment of these tasks requires time-consuming learning processes. So a newborn baby is conscious because it has the neural architecture that the evolution of unlimited associative learning has built up. It is the architecture that enables the unification of stimuli into image, the integration and prioritization of evaluative signals, the mechanisms that ensure the durability of this neurophysiological states, and so on. So a newborn baby is conscious, although it can only accomplish UAL when it has stored enough memories and has learned about the world and his own actions. So phylogeny, ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny in this case. While UAL and consciousness were entangled during evolution, in development, consciousness precedes UAL. Now, this kind of if you accept the kind of logic that we're suggesting here, this has predictions. We can actually say, well, if this is the case, then we have a series of predictions about what we expect to find in the living world. So first, the claim that UAL is a natural cluster, in the sense that all the different elements grouped together in animals that show unlimited associative learning, leads to the prediction that all these elements are ontogenetically correlated. So we expect that the development of one element will facilitate or enable the development of more of the other elements. these elements will be phylogenetically correlated. So if we find a species in which one element is evolved, there is a good chance, not a certainty of course, but a good chance that other elements increases the probability that the species has also the other elements of UAL. And the elements are medically correlated. So brain injuries that affect one element will have some effect. There is some modularity, of course, but we expect to have some effect on other elements as well. So this is one set of predictions. The other set of predictions follows from the claim that UAL is a transition marker to experiencing systems. And here we can look, especially it's easiest to look in humans, but people are beginning to look also in non-human species. We can have experimental protocols such as backward masking that selectively switch off conscious perception and leave unconscious perception in place. Now, we expect that you cannot do UAL tasks in a subliminal manner. If you mask the stimuli, a kind of compound stimuli, for example, and you expect people to discriminate or to do other UAL tasks, they will not be able to do them under masking conditions, but they will be able to do simpler tasks under masking conditions. We also expect that blind sight patients will be unable to perform UAL on stimuli presented in the region of the visual field, which has been damaged, but they will be capable of more limited forms of learning, even if presented in that side of the field. We also expect that whatever the neural signatures of subjective experience in humans or other animals may be, they will be also correlated with unlimited associative learning. So these are the predictions that follow from the assumption that UAL is a marker of consciousness, and that there's a relationship between them. Now, in animals, we expect to find that indeed animals that have the kind of brain structures that point to that enable integration, complex evaluation, storage, and memory storage will show UAL and will be able to evaluate action options in a context-dependent manner. And we also expect that in conditions equivalent to masking in humans, the animals will fail UAL tasks, although they will be still able to show simpler forms of learning. So these are strong predictions, and all these predictions are strong predictions, but it is testable. We can work. We can either support or disprove the hypothesis. Now, I just want to pinpoint the kind of tasks that we think that animals will not be able to do in mask conditions. They will not be able to do spatial learning, complex discrimination learning. Trace conditioning will not be possible under mask conditions. Reverse learning that points to flexible evaluated system will not be possible, and they will not be able to have motivational trade-offs during decision making. So this is what we expect, and the evidence that we have from humans at the moment supports this, and also from monkeys, rhesus monkeys, supports this these predictions so far. Now, when we're looking at which groups, when we're looking at the groups of animals that have unlimited associative learning, we see them here as the gray circles with the rays, like little suns. These are the three groups of the mollusks, the three phyla, the mollusks, the arthropods, and the vertebrates. Those that have only gray without the rays are those that show simple associative learning, but not UAL. And the ones that have just round empty circles show learning through non-associative learning only. A lot of groups have not been examined, and in some groups you don't have a nervous system at all. You have a nervous system. There are only two groups in which you don't have a nervous system. These are the sponges and the placozoa. But in some groups you don't have in many groups you don't have a brain, a central unit where onto which everything converges. Now, when we're looking at when these groups first appeared and when we have evidence from fossils for structures that are indicative of unlimited associative learning, integration units, memory units, and so on, we see that the two groups appeared in the Cambrian, right? Here. And they appeared, the two groups, the vertebrates and the arthropods, appeared 542 million years ago. And the cephalopods, coleoid cephalopods, mollusks, appeared 250 million years later. So the Cambrian, during the Cambrian, which is a very, very important and dramatic kind of period in evolutionary history, because most of the phyla that we now know have appeared during this period, although of course not completely all of a sudden. There was there were some groups that we see some evidence for complex organisms before that, but it is the period during which there was a huge explosion of new body forms. And most of the big macroscopic animals and the body forms of this animals have appeared during this period. Almost all the phyla that we know today appeared then. Now, it's very interesting that the first conscious animals seem to have appeared during this period, the vertebrates and the arthropods. And we have suggested that not only did associative learning and unlimited associative learning appear in the Cambrian, but it was also one of the things that drove the evolution that led to the Cambrian, the very rapid evolution that led to the Cambrian explosion. Because associative learning, and especially unlimited associative learning, is allowing creatures to learn about environment, to adapt to the environment during ontogeny. And the ontogenetic adaptation can lead in due course also to phylogenetic adaptation. It can lead to antagonistic and to cooperative arms races and feedbacks. Because animals learn who is predator, who is prey, how to approach them, how to deal with them, they can learn about mates, they can learn about abiotic aspects of the environment. And this kind of interactions that the unlimited associative learning allows can lead to very rapid and very dramatic evolution, the kind of evolution that we see during the Cambrian explosion. There is a lot, one can say a lot about this, because the Cambrian explosion at some point stopped being so explosive, so to speak. But nevertheless, and the kind of relationships between the different species sort of stabilized. But during the first period, during the first, let's say, 30, 40, 50 million years, there was a very big, there was a very rapid kind of evolution. And we think that the evolution of unlimited associative learning has played a part in the explosion. And what you see here in this picture are the kind of creatures that we know existed during the Cambrian explosions. Mostly you see here arthropods, and you see two little modest vertebrates, two little fish, one here and one there. One, I don't know if you see my cursor, I hope you do, but one is on the left-hand side just after the top animal, a little fish, and the other one is in the middle, above the one with the many legs, also another little fish. Okay, so I will conclude now and say, and I would like to conclude and to say some things that go a little bit maybe also beyond what I have said during the lecture. First of all, what I have suggested here is that unlimited associative learning is a transition marker of consciousness. And I have explained the rationale behind this proposition, which is based on the kind of logic that Ganti used when he tried to understand the origin, the notion of life and the origin of life. We argued that the evolution of UAL led to minimal consciousness. So what drove the evolution of consciousness was the evolution of learning, of a particular type of complex learning. The point is that it is important to note that UAL is a positive marker of minimal animal consciousness. So when we have UAL, we can tell that the animal is conscious. But if it doesn't have UAL, we cannot tell if it is conscious or not. It is only, at this point, we only have a positive marker. And it is an evolutionary, and this is related to the positive marker point, but it is slightly different. It is an evolutionary and not an ontogenetic marker. So while during phylogeny, the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of unlimited associative learning were entangled, during ontogeny, consciousness precedes the development of UAL and the manifestation of UAL. We can conclude from the fossil record and from the distribution of UAL that UAL evolved in arthropods and invertebrates during the Cambrian. It was and we suggested that it was one of the drivers of the Cambrian explosions. In cephalopods, it evolved 250 million later. That's when we see the coleoid cephalopods, which show evidence for UAL. We suggested that there are experiments and observations and comparisons that can test the predicted links between UAL and consciousness. And lastly, although robots can implement UAL and that implement UAL will be built one day, there are two things I want to say. First, it doesn't mean necessarily that they will be conscious. Just as a genetic algorithm that is implemented in a computer chip does not render the chip alive, although the genetic algorithm sort of implements unlimited heredity. There are endless numbers of combinations in between the 0 and 1s, for example, that we can imagine. But what we can say is that if we find something like that, some kind of unlimited system like that, it is a secondary kind of it is a secondary type of unlimited system, and it suggests that there is a first order type of unlimited system that constructed it. But this is the first thing that I want to say about the possibility of implementing UAL in robots. The other thing that I want to say is that it is enormously difficult to implement UAL in robots. UAL is a domain general kind of intelligence. It is not the ability to play Go in the best possible way. It is the ability to do many different things in a very flexible way. There is no artificial intelligence device that is capable of doing it at present. And the constraints on such devices and the affordances that the biological material and the affordances of biological material may be very important here. I'm open-minded about the possibility of building conscious robots, by the way, but I think that it is going to be far more difficult than we think. So Thank you very much. And I hope that you can have now a cup of tea or coffee, and we shall soon reassemble for the question for the Q&A. Thank you.